The next topic we're going to take a look at has to do with chemistry, and we've already gone over a little bit of the physics associated with the microscopes in terms of things like total magnification and refraction and what's going on there. But now we're going to switch gears a little bit and take a look at some of the concepts of chemistry that are really important to biology. And one thing I like to tell students is that when we look at any kind of system in biology out there, if we tear it down to its most fundamental basic level, now you're looking at the chemicals that are behind the life there. So we want to understand a little bit about some of these principles of chemistry because they will have an impact on our understanding of what we're looking at in the biological laboratory, especially. So when we take a look at this figure here that was on that introductory slide, we can think about this idea of what types of matter do you see in this picture. And if you think about it, matter is something that we define as it takes up space and it has mass. And when you look at the basic unit of matter out there, you're looking at atoms and elements. And these elements have these unique physical and chemical properties. And when we get down to the level of atoms and elements, we're looking at substances that cannot be easily transformed into other substances. And so if we look at this picture here, we can see some things that are taking up matter or taking up mass and space that's out there. Obviously, when we look at this glacier, that's an easy one to see. You can see there is some land in the background, but we don't tend to think about the fact that this water down here is also taking up space and it has mass. And the other thing that we don't see here is the gases that are up here, the atmosphere that is here. So there is a lot of matter in this picture. And so that's what we want to really take a look at is this basic unit of matter when we're looking at atoms and elements that are out there, because these are going to combine to form molecules or compounds. And that's where the atoms are being held together by bonds. So we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the bonds that are out there. But first, we want to take a look at your basic structure for matter that's composed of these atoms of elements. And hopefully you remember from chemistry, I know a lot of you have been pelted with this over and over, and sort of the way you can look at it as eventually we hope that you all will go past the memorization stage and come to the appreciation stage where you can really appreciate and sit down and say, oh, that's why they said this was important, and that's why my instructor told me to study this. Now I understand why they were going into all that detail. But if you look at the structure of your atom here, we can find that it does have this central nucleus right here. And packed into the nucleus, you're going to find your positively charged protons. And you're also going to find these other particles that are known as neutrons because they are neutral. They don't have a positive or a negative charge. And so these particles are sitting here inside this general region that chemists will refer to as the nucleus. And then orbiting around these particles in the nucleus is where we're going to find our negatively charged particles known as electrons. And so this is really a two-dimensional diagram for what really should be something where these electrons are just orbiting around here all over. So think like the atmosphere around the planet. There's the planet Earth. There's your protons and neutrons. And then around that, we've got this shell where these electrons are just going to be circling around like satellites going around there. The chemists that are out there, they get excited when they see something like this, the periodic table of elements, because this is showing a whole bunch of information about all of the known elements that are out there. And if you are able to blow this little diagram up, you can start to see that you can learn some of the characteristics of each of these little boxes with the different elements. You've got your atomic symbol there. There's your hydrogen, so it's also named down below on this thing. You've got a little bit of information about the relative atomic mass on this particular one. And when we look at the atomic mass, that is the number of protons and the number of neutrons that you're going to find. And it's these differences in things like the number of protons and neutrons that give us these different kinds of elements. And so that's why we can't tear these down and still have the same properties, because if you tear this down, now you've got a different kind of element that's out there. The other thing that we can find on here is the atomic number in the upper left corner on this particular one, because you will often find these keys associated with your periodic table, and that is telling you about the number of protons. And when we look at this, normally we can take that atomic number and figure, okay, the number of positively charged particles is going to be equivalent to the number of negatively charged particles. And we'll see that that always isn't, or that isn't always true out there. But one of the other interesting things that people have found is when you look at isotopes of elements that are out there, and these are elements that actually have a different number of neutrons floating around in their nucleus. So they're going to be heavier, and you might have heard about things like heavy water out there. But here we can see an example with carbon that has this atomic mass over here of 12 because it's got 6 protons and 6 neutrons. And in this case, it also has an equivalent number of electrons circling around the nucleus there. And if you have carbon that picks up an extra neutron, and we can do this, you can actually bombard carbon 12 with neutrons and cause it to pick up some extra ones, and then you have what's known as an isotope of the element. And here you can see carbon 12 can become carbon 13, so it's a little bit heavier, and over here we've got carbon 14. Notice the number of protons and the number of electrons are not changing. You're just getting a heavier version of this particular element right here. And really kind of the interesting thing about this is when you look at isotopes, they're actually not stable. Because you have those extra neutrons in there, they tend to decay over time because that nucleus is really unstable. And when the neutrons are decaying, you actually will get a release of different kinds of subatomic particles, but also energy. And that's where we run into problems with these radioactive isotopes that are out there. These guys have, think about this, U-235 here. If this is carbon 12, this thing is huge. And when it decays, it's going to be giving off particles and energy. And that's where radioactive isotopes, that energy that's coming off of there, can actually cause damage to different structures in your body, like your DNA. And if you lose your DNA, you effectively are going to lose the brains of the cell that pass on the memory from one generation to another. We do take advantage of some of these things, and because of that, and use some of these radioactive isotopes to treat cancerous growths that are out there. If we take a look, though, at these elements that are out there, we actually do find a pattern in life that is out there. And if you take an organism out there, about 90% of the mass that is making up different organisms that are out there are actually only a few of these elements that sometimes we call the major element of life that's out there. And here you can see this is not in order so much as it's just an acronym for remembering CHON. The 4 primary elements that we're going to find in everything, whether it's a bacteria cell, up to you, is you're going to find a good amount of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen out there. And I put the atomic mass and the number of electrons to just see these are some of the simpler kinds of elements of life. And because they're simpler, there's a lot more of them available out there. And I put this little thing over here so that you can see that these elements of life do have significance for all kinds of life that's out there. But especially we want to focus on microbiology. And so when you look, carbon is making up basically the backbone for a bunch of molecules that we can find in cells that are out there. When you look at hydrogen, hopefully, you know, it's part of water that's out there. And it's also part of a lot of these different biological molecules. And one kind of interesting thing is that a lot of microbes can actually fart out hydrogen gas right here, or H2. When we look at these other 2 elements, oxygen and nitrogen out there, these are found in a lot of different kinds of organic molecules that are made by cells, and that includes things like proteins and nucleic acids. And oxygen that is in the atmosphere, we breathe it in, and so we use it in a set of controlled chemical reactions in what's known as metabolism, as our cells are building up and breaking down our food and using energy to build new parts to cells. And then your nitrogen over there, you can see it's in proteins, nucleic acids, and for certain microbes that are out there, they can actually use the nitrogen gas that's in the atmosphere. And not all organisms can do that, but it's kind of interesting. There's actually a lot more nitrogen in the air you're breathing in than there is oxygen. We do also find some minor elements of life. And when we look at these minor elements, we're talking about something that is less than 1% of a cell. So your major elements that are out there really do make up a huge part of an organism, but these kinds of things are what I refer to as they're like the pinch of salt that's added to the chawn. And you can see a variety of different kinds of elements, some of them lighter and some of them a little bit heavier here, but we still haven't hit the bottom of that periodic table where you see the really, really heavy ones that are really more uncommon. But you can see, again, various components like nucleic acids. These are in proteins. These are in some factors that help our enzymes to work. When we look at phosphorus, it plays a big role in membranes and cell walls of bacteria that are out there. When you look at something like potassium, this is a major ion or charged atom that is out there that we find in cells. And it's also essential for membranes. Something like magnesium is going to be different from the other ones that we see here because it's actually an element for enzymes to use. So it does feature in that kind of idea like an cofactor. When you look at calcium, we always think milk, it does a body good, and the calcium is going to be used for our bones, but it's also something that's floating around in solutions, and it can be used when bacteria cells are making cell walls. If they don't have calcium, it doesn't actually work. They also need this for making something called spores that we'll take a look at a little bit more in Chapter 3. This is basically used to make a protective rock around the DNA in a cell when it goes dormant. And then the last sort of minor element that we can find out here is iron. And this is kind of interesting. It is used in energy production, and it's essential to a lot of enzymes that are out there. And it turns out iron is actually one of those kind of things that are really important for bacteria that are causing diseases in us, known as pathogens. They want to scavenge the iron out of your body. And so an easy source of that is to get it from your bloodstream, from your red blood cells. And so there's this battle that's gone on between our cells and the pathogens over trying to scavenge the iron out of your system. There's also trace elements. And trace elements are like the pinch of salt to add flavor to your chawn. And these are typically going to be more of these metal ions like these guys down here, but things like manganese, and cobalt and zinc and copper and stuff that you would find in multivitamins that are out there. So when we look at this property of these atoms that are out there and think about the chawn that we have out there, we want to sort of start to think about how are these atoms being held together to make the molecules that are making up the cells that are out there. And so that's what we'll take a look in the next video when we start to look at bonds that are out there.